Welcome to Econ Thoughts, the interview series and the podcast of the Society for Professional Economists in London. And today we are very glad to have as a special guest Jonathan Haskel, who is Professor of Economics at the Imperial College Business School and since 2018 an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee for the Bank of England. He's also the author with T.M. Westlake of Capitalism Without Capital and more recently Restarting the Future, How to Fix the Intangible Economy. And we'll definitely be covering some of the issues related to the intangible economy throughout our conversation today. But before we do that, Jonathan, can I ask you briefly to introduce to our audience a little bit, tell a little bit about how you got where you are today, and also what do you enjoy the most in your work?
Thank you very much, Filippo, and hello to everybody. Thanks very much for tuning in. It's really nice to be on the podcast. I'm an economist. I did economics A-level at school and rather liked it. I then went on to do economics at university. I bet many of your listeners did economics at university. I got to say, A-level economics is really quite good. I had the great fortune to do university economics, and it was very good. This was at University of Bristol many years ago. But many university economics courses are maybe not quite so good. So many of your listeners who might have done economics at university might have been a bit put off. So I apologize on behalf of the economics community for that. But I've sort of been caught the bug of economics ever since. And then I've had the great good fortune to be at the Bank of England for the last 6 years.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful. And I have to say, my experience was pretty positive as well.
Oh, very good.
If I can actually get a little bit of advertising, I went to Trento University, which is in Italy, which is an excellent economic department, but also went to spend a year in Durham University. And I know that you were up there actually for a presentation so I think it actually a very good universities as well.
Yeah, I was, and I met a terrific group of students there. And what's interesting about that is that they offer PPE, politics, philosophy, economics there, which not many British universities do. Forgive me, I don't know about Italian universities. Maybe that's a way of the future, actually, to have a few more combined degrees like that.
Yeah, it might be, and definitely, obviously, kind of economics and philosophy go well together. And in fact, they were actually very linked together back in the days of Adam Smith and before that. But thank you for that little bit of an intro, Jonathan. And I was about to ask you the first question, talk a little bit about productivity, but then also I saw your post on X or Twitter, X, formerly Twitter, last night. We talked a little bit about US productivity and UK productivity and whether kind of there was a boom in the US and what it was behind it, but also why it's not in the UK. So I think is probably a good prompt actually to start the conversation, talking a little bit about where we are related to productivity at the moment, globally in the US and in the UK as well. Are we in the middle of a boom? It was just a little bit of a mirage created by kind of some issue related to post-COVID. Is AI actually coming into the rescue and bringing us away from the kind of low productivity periods before kind of the pandemic? Or actually, where are we in terms of with the new technology? I think it's a little bit of an outline of the status of productivity at the moment and what we might expect going forward.
Thanks, Filippo. All really good questions. So let me start, and please interrupt me. I don't want to give a long lecture. I think it's important when doing productivity to think about the short run and the long run. So we're already into economic speak straight away. What do I mean by that? Short run productivity can vary an enormous amount, and it can vary an enormous amount for reasons which in some sense are a little bit spurious, notably around utilization. So anybody at the workplace knows that you can easily raise short-term productivity in a restaurant just by piling more people into the restaurant with the same number of waiters and the same waitresses and the same number of chefs and so forth. And so productivity is going to go up that way. So I think as productivity analysts, we're rather less interested in those short run movements in productivity. And the reason I say all that, Filippo, is that people are getting excited about the US productivity increase, which you've seen in the data, but it's only been there in the last couple of quarters. So my first response is to tell people to get not quite so excited about that because productivity can be driven, as I say, by those very short run changes. What we're much more interested in, I think, is about the long run changes, and that's much more to do with AI and that kind of thing.
Okay. And has it come out in the data yet, the AI, in
Yeah.
any data, even if it's not productivity? Is there any sign that we should look out for? Or if it hasn't come out, as we look at the data in the next 12 months, or whether it's from the statistical data or the news, what should we be looking out for to say, oh, okay, I can see the sign of AI and kind of the new technology coming in a little bit. Therefore, I could expect productivity, the long-term one, the one that we
Yeah.
care about, coming back up.
So that's exactly what our post was about. And if I could back up for a minute, Filippo, if you'll forgive
Yeah,
me, you kindly mentioned the work on intangibles that Stian Westlake
yeah,
and I have been doing. So but maybe I could just say a word about that.
sure.
So we're in this long run game by wondering about what's going to happen in the long run. What is, according to Stian and I, the big long run change in the economy over the last 20, 30 years? It's the move from the tangible economy to the intangible economy. So in the old days, we made lots of stuff. We drilled for oil. We made lots of vehicles and ships and planes and goodness knows what else. We're still doing that. But increasingly now, we're making much more intangible items. So Google are making a search engine. That's just a piece of knowledge. That's an intangible asset that they've got. Apple make gorgeous software for us to play music on and all of that. So again, that's an intangible asset, the software and the design and the reputation and that kind of thing. McKinsey offer management consultancy about how to run your business. So the knowledge of the business process is an intangible asset which companies have got. So anyway, there's been a move from the tangibles to the intangibles. And that raises, we think, lots of interesting issues around measurement and all that kind of thing. So where does AI come into all of this? Um, so the way I think about AI is via the Google Cats project. So I think the Google Cats project is a nice example. This is a project which Google has spent a number of years on, attempting to get the computer to recognize a cat. Now, what's interesting about all of this, or interesting to me at least, is, a 2-year-old child can recognize a cat. So why is it that the computer can't do it? Or why is it so difficult for the computer to do it, yet a 2-year-old child can do it? And the answer is, of course, that a cat is quite a complicated thing as far as a computer is concerned. So the first thing is the cat's got 4 legs, but a table has got 4 legs. So it's actually quite difficult for the computer to figure out the difference between a cat and a table. Second is cat's got fur, but so has a dog and a lion and a leopard and other close relatives. Difficult for the computer to do that as well. So what do Google do when they do all of this? They've got amazing, incredible fast computers. They're building their own computers, running all the Google software, which they all write in-house, looking at gigantic databases. That's how I kind of think
Mhm.
about AI. So what does all that mean in terms of what I've been rabbiting on about? A fast computer is a tangible asset, and we count those tangible assets when we do national income accounting under tangible investment. Software, as I was just mentioning, is an intangible asset, and we count that asset as well, as gradually intangible assets have begun to be counted in GDP. And a database is another intangible asset, but we don't yet quite know as a community how to count all of that. So what AI is a mix of the tangibles and the intangibles, some of which is measured and some of which is not measured. So where I'm getting to is the little tweet that we put out yesterday asked the question, if that's what AI is, can we see anything in the data on the hardware? Can
Mhm.
we see anything in the data on software? And we wouldn't expect to see anything on the data and databases because we don't really measure the databases very well. And what Josh Martin and I put out yesterday was a diagram which compared the UK and the US. On the hardware side, US hardware has been zooming ahead of UK hardware really for quite a few years, actually. Interestingly, on the software side, those investments between the US and the UK were quite similar. But once we got to the pandemic, UK software investment rather flattened, and US software investment has absolutely shot up. Now, there might be other explanations, but if, as I say, your model of AI is, or indications of AI, the mix of the hardware and the software, the mix of the tangible and the intangible. This looks like a little bit of evidence that you can see something in the data that there might be something to this AI improvement. Sorry for that long explanation, but I hope that made some sense.
No, it definitely does, and it's interesting to understand a little bit what you said about the impact of the pandemic. Was there anything particular about the pandemic that kind of spurred that US investment, or was already kind of baked in because of previous investment in the hardware and company were already kind of developing the software, and it just happened to be coincident with the pandemic, or the pandemic provoked a little bit of an acceleration, particularly in the US?
Yeah, so the way again, measurement people like me think of the pandemic is before the pandemic, we'd taken the very sensible step of investing in a massive communications network called the internet, and we didn't quite know how useful it was going to be. We were busy sending each other pictures of cats and this, that, and the other. And then the pandemic comes, and don't get me wrong, all sorts of terrible things happened in the pandemic, but at least from one point of view, people were able to work at home, at least those who were in those kind of jobs. And we realized that we'd invested in this communications network, which precisely enabled that. We're talking on a video now.
Mm,
People were able to sort of do all of that. So you're right, Felipe, the pandemic in some sense built on that previous investment. But then there was a burst of investment, especially around software, and a little bit of hardware as well. I mean, people had computers at home, but there were improvements in software, Zoom and Teams and all that kind of thing as well. Um, that little burst of investment, as I say, just didn't continue in the UK, but it does seem to have continued in the US. So it looks like it's not just a pandemic story
mm,
in the US. Um, as I say, that looks quite different from other types of economy. So there's definitely an element of that.
yeah.
But I think if you were looking for signs for AI, an AI revival, at least in the US, there seems to be something interesting in the data.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. And if you could put, no, I appreciate it's very difficult to put, but if you could put a number on your expectation for actually that change in productivity. Obviously, productivity kind of fell from the highest, around maybe a kind of the 2% that it was maybe in the 80s and the 90s, and then it fell
Mm,
actually below the 1% during
mm.
the teens, if I can use that word, 2010s, and before kind of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you were to think like it's probably gonna go back up, are we looking at an increase of 0.5, 1, 2? I've seen quite a lot of estimates coming from kind of researchers, whether it's Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or in some other organization where there is a very, very big range.
Mm.
Are we looking at a big explosion similar to the one in the 90s or even more? Or is it just a notch higher and therefore there is not going to be a substantial difference? Because it will have, and I will talk in later on, a big implication for a lot of other policies as well.
Yeah, I'm going to hedge this around. I find it very difficult to put a number on it, but let me try to be a little bit more cooperative. That's not a very helpful answer, is it? Let me try to be a little bit more cooperative. The crucial thing I think is this. Go back to my intangibles framework, if you don't mind, Filippo. What's another way of thinking about the different dimensions of that? Um, the way we often think about it is the sort of upstream sector and the downstream sector. So the upstream sector is the sector who are essentially commercializing
Mhm.
knowledge. That's what they're doing. They're figuring out new ways to do things. And the downstream sector then put that into action. So Walmart, for example, who are incredibly good at shipping and tessellated packaging and efficient ways of supplying all their shops. They're, as it were, the downstream sector who are using that commercialized knowledge in the upstream sector. The upstream sector is the same firm in that example, but that's I think a kind of helpful way
Mm.
of thinking about what a lot of firms do. They've got a kind of an operations side, um, and then a sort of an ideas kind of side as well. So the reason I'm saying all of this is you could think of AI in at least two ways. One way to think of AI is it just reflects the downstream sector. So I was at a garden center recently. They've got a whole load of their marketing people answering questions from people who've just bought gardening equipment and want to know how to operate the lawnmower and things like that. These are pretty easy questions, to be honest, but that's what people want to know. What this garden center has now done is they've got an AI machine which reads their own website, which has the answer to all these questions, and then answers the emails that everybody writes in about, how do I mow the lawn? And the 4 or 5 people, the human beings who used to answer those questions in the marketing department, are now going off and doing something else. So that's just a kind of capital to labor substitution, right? Instead of the 4 or 5 people answering the questions, the machine answers the questions. The machine can answer the questions in literally a nanosecond. So that's an incredibly efficient way of doing it. Interestingly, they found that if the computer emails the answer back straight away, then the customer complains because the customer knows that it's come from a machine. So now what they do is they delay the answer by a couple of hours so that the customer thinks that it's actually coming from a human being rather than machine. And now the customers write back saying, "Dear Jean," or "Dear whoever it was, thank you so much. You've saved my marriage by telling me how to mow the lawn," and all that kind of stuff. So that's all the sort of downstream sector side. And if that happens, capital labor substitution, that's fine. Productivity will go up, but there's a limit to that process. The reason I say the upstream sector is if AI helps the discovery and the commercialization of new knowledge, then we really have what economists call a general purpose technology. So if you go, for example, to a pharmaceutical company who are trying to mix together lots of different drugs in various ways to create a sort of super drug, artificial intelligence in the computer is really going to help those companies because there are so many combinations. You've got 1,000 drugs, 1,000 chemical compounds which you own, and you want to combine them all in some other way. That's 1,000 factorial. So pretty soon you're going to get to some very big numbers. The computer can help you with all of that. So if the artificial intelligence and computing help in the upstream sector, then we've got innovation in the process of innovation, if you sort of see what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's then an additional cascade to the companies who are then going to make the drugs, for example, in the downstream sector, or the companies who are going to answer the customer emails in the downstream sector. So if artificial intelligence can do all of that, then we've got a real productivity boom on our hands, and maybe that might take us back much closer to the 2% we had before.
Thank you. That's interesting. And obviously that kind of upstream is the target that we want to achieve. But obviously we see whether and in what time frame actually we'll be able to get to that particular position.
Yeah, the Bank of England has done a survey on this actually, where we've asked mostly downstream firms how long they think that it will take them for artificial intelligence to show up in productivity. And the median answer you get is a couple of years actually. Which is a little bit contrary to my garden center experience. There's a particular firm who I met in the Northeast where I was recently. That was literally plug and play. So they trained the machine. The training of the machine took 20 minutes, and then they stuck it on to answer the questions, and then they had to change it, as I say, from the nanosecond to the 2-hour delay. And that took little bit of time to figure all that out. But that was just plug and play. So for them, it was very quick. Other firms say a couple of years. But again, I think that's part of the uncertainty that's hanging around all of this. I think if you talk to me, I'm sure you have on your podcast, if you talk to people from the West Coast of the US, a lot of them will give you a plug and play story and a plug and play kind of example, at both downstream and upstream. At which point, as I say, we're into a quick productivity gain and potentially quite large. Our survey evidence, as I say, it gave the 2 years mostly downstream. I think we know rather less about what's going on upstream. But I must say, if I think of the research companies I go to or the research departments of the companies that I go to, a number of them are pretty optimistic actually about the use of AI.
Yeah, though I think just not sound a little bit not pessimistic or anything. It's just that it might happen relatively quickly. It might be plug and play for the companies. But to show up in the data, and you work at the statistical agencies as well, that's where that's maybe the 2 or 3 years it takes to actually show up in the official data, even if companies might actually perform it relatively quickly.
Oh, and in fact, I'm sorry to say, Filippo, it's actually worse than that. But so sorry to break this news, which is it might be negative to start with. Why might it be negative to start with? So go back to my intangible framework, if you don't mind. Let's suppose the company does the plug and play, but has to invest in, let's say, a new business process in order to
Mm.
revise the supply chain relationships and improve the way that customers are served and all that kind of thing. Whilst they're doing that, of course, productivity is rather low. They're spending all this money, which is building the knowledge of a new business process, but that's not counted as an investment. That's just counted as kind of intermediate spending. That's counted as kind of wasteful business expenses. So there are actually quite a few ways where, from a excuse me, from a statistical national income accounting point of view, actually during that initial investment phase, GDP can actually fall. So it
Mm.
actually looks like productivity GDP is going down.
Down.
What it then does is it then goes back up for the reasons that we were just both talking about. So indeed, that could be the cause of why it's difficult to see this in the GDP numbers.
Yeah, so it's a kind of bit of a J curve as well, where it goes down a little bit and then it
Exactly a J
up.
curve. Exactly
Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you mentioned it on the US and the UK, and obviously we had kind of a recent on this podcast, we had Diane Coyle as well from the University of Cambridge, and she was talking a little bit about one of the reasons why the UK actually might have fallen behind. And she mentioned about the lack of investment as well as one of the reasons. In the data you've seen on the work you done other kind of at Imperial or kind of the Bank of England, is that kind of any reason why the UK might have fallen behind a little bit, particularly after the pandemic, but even before that, in terms of lack of investment, whether it's in infrastructure or in generically in business investment R&D?
Yeah, there are two ways that companies can improve their productivity. Firstly, they can get better machines, and secondly, they can use the machines more efficiently. So when productivity goes down, or the pace of productivity growth goes down, us economists like to try to separate it out between, is it that companies are investing less, they're using less machines, or are they using the machines somewhere other less efficiently, or is the growth in efficiency less than it previously was? And the answer in the UK is that about a third of the productivity growth slowdown since the global financial crisis. About a third of it is due to less investment using less machines, but the other third is due to the efficiency gains that used to be going on at about 1% per year, falling to 0.1% per
Mm.
year, or some rather lower number than that. So it can't all be investment in those machines. Now, then that gets back to the counting issue. Since a lot of these intangible investments are not actually counted, then they don't show up as a change in investment, but they do show up as an apparent change in the efficiency with which that investment is not being used. So take databases as an example. We try to count databases. We don't do it very well. If companies go around buying databases in order to then develop better products and better ways of serving their customers, the investment in those databases is not counted. And so during that investment phase, it looks like companies are spending all this money on nothing, which looks like slow productivity. So the distinction between, once you're in this
Mm.
intangible world, the distinction between how much are we investing and how efficiently are we using those investments become a big matter of measurement as well.
Yeah. And is there any work at the moment in the various statistical agency to better accounting for the intangible?
Yeah, the statistical agencies are pushing ahead a lot on all of this, and some of that work is publicly available. If people want to Google the EU Clems Intan Invest website, there's lots of international data on all of that. If you just search Intan Invest,
Mhm.
international productivity data, you'll get all that information. And statistical agencies are very active on all of this, actually, in trying to move forward and count some of these investments. Of course, the statistical agencies have got lots of other problems they've got to deal with as well. The response rates in post-COVID in the labour market are very difficult to deal with. So I think a lot of them are putting a lot of their efforts into improving on that stage. But the move towards counting more intangible assets is a sort of consistent move, which they're keeping going with. That's statistical agencies counting GNP and GDP and all of that. The That's national income accounting. The company accounting agencies are very reluctant. They're very reluctant to capitalize these intangible investments, and very nervous about whether they should or should not appear on the balance sheet.
Okay. Is there a tax reason, or what will be the reason for that bit of reluctant?
I just think well, they're very difficult to count.
Yeah.
So, what's the value to Google of all the software that they're writing to power, to be part of their AI? Um, in some sense, that's got to be at the very heart of the company. The search engine and the software which does all the advertising is at the heart of the company. So it is the key asset in the company. But it is, here I admit, as far as the accounting agencies are concerned, it's a very difficult thing to count.
Mm.
But where that takes you, unfortunately, is to a situation in which management accounts, company accounts, which these companies publicly report, just end up being really not very informative about what the underlying asset structure in the company is, which has got all sorts of implications, I think, for how financial markets process this and how companies access finance from banks.
Okay, no, that's interesting, and another area obviously kind of for future kind of research and development. If I may kind of switch a little bit on the topic, still staying on the productivity and intangible side, but looking at how it might affect actually policy going forward, in particular
Mm,
monetary and fiscal policy. Obviously, there's been a lot of the discussion, and I had a number of conversation in both in my company and other kind of areas around the future of interest rates, our star, the natural interest rates.
mm,
Obviously, a lot of conversation around the falling on the kind of interest rate, natural rate over the last kind of 3 or 4 decades as well. And a lot of it was due to a number of reasons, including the fall in productivity as well. Now, if
mm.
productivity kind of picks up again, that might lead potentially the interest rate kind of to increase and stay relatively higher than it was pre-pandemic. How do you see the generic productivity kind of development over the next kind of few years, but also the intangible economy and the shift with the intangible economy affecting actually the interest rates and also the monetary policy in general?
Yeah, thanks, Filippo. Great set of questions, and a tricky set of questions as well. Let me start with something which I think the commentators often talk about, but is not right. People often say, "Gosh, well, what we need is we need a bit more productivity, because then we'll have more supply, and then we can run the economy hotter." We, monetary authorities, the
Mm,
government, whatever the responsible authority is, the responsible authority can run the economy hotter than would otherwise be the case, because inflation won't take off so much. And that's a comment you hear a lot, that
mm,
productivity growth will, as I say, enable us to run the economy more quickly, and is a way out of some of the difficulties. And I think that's not right. And the reason it's not right, um, is, of course, inflation is the balance between supply and demand. So it's quite true, if we had more supply out there for given demand, we'd have less inflation. But the trouble is, demand might change. If there's more productivity growth, then consumers aren't stupid. They'll reasonably realize that the feasible level of real wages and the feasible level of incomes is going up, and they'll shift their demand up. And therefore, those demand changes probably will match quite closely those supply changes. So I think the first thing I'd say when it comes to productivity and policy in general is the sort of baseline model that people have in their mind about higher productivity growth makes everything easier just isn't right, actually.
mm,
Um, so that's one thing. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. One exception to that is on the fiscal policy side. If the cake is bigger, and as a democratic society, we choose to, have the same amount of tax rate, but of a bigger pie, then there's going to be more taxes going in, or we could lower taxes, or whatever it might be. So it does ease things on that side, but it's not so much on the inflation side. So that's one set of remarks. The other set of remarks is around our star, and all of that, as you say. And this is, an issue which has kind of been hanging over monetary policy, as all the listeners know, for sort of 30 odd years. The
yeah.
natural rate of interest looks like it's been declining, to some very, very low levels, certainly pre-pandemic. Um, all central banks set their interest rates not in the context of what the market is, and if the market is it has got a very low interest rate as a kind of equilibrium, then central banks have got to follow suit. Otherwise, they'd be overly tightening or overly loosening, depending upon how they do it. Quite what has been driving that change in the natural interest rate is kind of hard to get at, and as your listeners will know, and as you alluded to in the question, there seem to be sort of two driving forces on the sort of person preferences side, sort of time, the preferences that people have for time. We've got an aging society, a society living for longer. So you might imagine people have become more, inverted commas, patient, because they're going to live longer into their retirement. They need to save more, and that would drive interest rates down. Um, Equally, if productivity goes down, then firms might be investing less, because they might be thinking, well, what's the point of investing? I'm not going to get much out in the future. Whereas if productivity is going up, my investment might yield me, terrific things because I'm using a better technology. So that also pushes interest rates down as well. And those, I think, are the two main forces which have been pushing down on rates. If productivity turns around, going back to our earlier discussion, that would potentially push up on these natural rates. On the other hand, we don't think that longevity is going to reverse anytime soon, right? People carry on living longer, development of better medicines and so forth. That pushes down on rates. So I think that takes you to a situation of possibly some mild upward pressure on these very long-term rates. But there are a lot of ifs that are required with all of that. And again, it's back to the issue about whether artificial intelligence has got these broader effects that we were talking about earlier along.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think obviously you've seen quite a lot of different estimates around kind of how rates might be going if in the future and forward as well in terms of the long term. I think probably before we can be close to conclude our interview today, I would probably kind of, in terms of the intangible economy, where is the balance going? Are we kind of the trend obviously has been kind of to shift away towards the intangible economy. Are we continuing to see that? And the reason why I asked that particular question is because generically we've seen a little bit of return of protectionism and policy. So to a certain extent, you almost see a little bit of a deglobalization as well. So a lot of the trends that we've seen since the 80s and the 90s have gone a little bit in reverse gears over the last 10 years. The increase in the rise of the geopolitics, more kind of political instability and so on. Is therefore similarly kind of the trend that was going towards that intangible economy, is that going to go in reverse a little bit, similar to some of the other trends? Or is it kind of baked in our current society and economy now that therefore you can't really stop that? I just think a little bit of where we are in terms of the bigger trends.
Again, it's a great question and a good thing to speculate on. My feeling is this is an enduring, baked-in trend. Actually, uh, it, so, okay, why don't we take a concrete example? I think that'd be easier to for people to think about. So the classic intangible example, it always seems to me, at least for UK listeners, but everybody in the world will be able to see this example, is Harry Potter. Right. So, what is Harry Potter, Britain's most famous innovation? It is surely something very intangible, namely the script and the idea of a little boy going to school and being a wizard. That's an intangible thing, right? But what's interesting about Harry Potter is it gets its value when that idea is combined with other intangible assets. So, for example, the fantastic computer software, which makes all the amazing movie, it makes all the amazing special effects on the movie. There's one other intangible asset. For example, the design, the theatrical design, which puts Harry Potter on the stage, and so it can go around and be in various theaters, all the way around the world. So it's those combination of intangible assets. Now, one of the things which is going to be helpful for those combination of intangible assets is if you've got a very big market. And surely one of the successes of Harry Potter is from globalization. Everybody, even remote Amazonian tribes, have surely heard of Harry Potter. So to your point, Filippo, if we have less globalization, and that means a smaller market, then at the margin, it's going to be less worthwhile for things like Harry Potter, those deeply intangible investments to be invested in. But you'd need a big collapse in the market for that to be the case. And the number of these intangible things, again, they go through the internet, so you'd have to cut off the internet. This is not a sort of physical piece of trade, which is occurring. So my feeling is that as societies generally get richer and demand more, varieties of goods and more different types of goods, the demand for these intangible assets will probably keep going up, actually. So globalization is some threat to that, but I think this is definitely a trend for the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's a very good point. And in fact, it kind of reminds a little bit of some of the data we've seen, particularly around the deglobalization trends, but also the decoupling between US and China. And it definitely has come up in the data when it comes to goods, to physical goods and trade in goods, but actually not in services. So to a certain extent, you see a little bit more on the good side in terms of the slowdown of globalization, but in service, you probably see much less. And therefore, in intangible, very similar, you might see much less of a trend. At the margins, maybe, but broadly still going up in a kind of a little bit of variable around that trend, but still trend going up.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's exactly right.
But that's fantastic. We come to the end of our session. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and also to give us a little bit of kind of an outline of your thoughts around the intangible economy, but also productivity and how it might affect actually policy going forward. So let me just kind of thank you again for your time and look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks, Filippo. Pleasure to be on. Thank you.
Thank you.